My name is Shaylin Taylor, and I'm so excited to be here today talking with you all about self advocacy. As someone who lives with type 2 spinal muscular atrophy and has been in a wheelchair for the last 14 years, advocacy has become a big part of my life, but it wasn't always that way. As people with disabilities, we've likely heard of self advocacy before, whether it be doctors, social workers, or parents telling us that we need to use our voice and advocate for our needs. Yet the trauma of life with a medical condition and its impact on using our voice are never considered. When I was a kid and was told I needed to use my voice, it made me feel as though there were yet another thing I was unable to do, as I simply could not find my voice in the midst of accepting my terminal diagnosis. I knew I wanted to speak up, but I never felt safe and never truly was taught how to use my voice. I couldn't even advocate within my own family at that time. In the beginning, when I would advocate, it came out short, bitter, and desperate. It felt like I was screaming, "Please see that my needs aren't being met and help me," but I could never actually form those words. Instead, I internalized a lot of anger, shame, and grief that I had to fight so hard to prove my worth. I began to believe that I didn't deserve all the luxuries that able bodied people have, and that because I was in a wheelchair, nobody would ever believe I actually deserved all the support my life required. At 22 years old, a doctor told me I had what he described as a few good years left, and I was terrified. I didn't know what that meant, what to do. Months after planning my own funeral and grieving my declining abilities, I watched as the first treatment for SMA was approved in the United States. It was a new sense of hope. A treatment finally existed for my once untreatable terminal diagnosis, and the advocacy flame within me ignited. 1 year after those in the US had access to treatment, Health Canada approved Spinraza, but only recommended the government fund it for those under 12. I wanted this treatment so bad. I didn't care that it was delivered through a spinal injection because pain had been a part of my life for as long as I could remember. Only this time, the pain had the potential to save my life. If I wanted this treatment, I had to believe that my life was worth $60,000. At the time, I didn't meet any criteria for funding, and nobody in Canada was actually receiving funded access to the drug. I had to believe that I deserved this treatment and the chance of a longer and healthier life. It terrified me because I knew that I would have to be vulnerable and ask for help, but mostly because I knew I had the power to turn my story into something that could change the lives of those with SMA all around Canada. I knew that this medication would not only save my life, but bring awareness to the available treatment for SMA, and I hoped that I could make it not only possible for people to receive the drug and have the government fund it, but also to prove its effectiveness in adults, as there was no clinical data at that time. I took the plunge with the convincing of my best friend and started sharing my story about the treatment that was held out of the SMA community's reach. I shared intimate details of my life and my condition with the media and social media, and people started listening. I gained momentum and met face to face with government officials, both provincially and federally, stressing why this treatment so desperately needed to be funded and fast. I flew to Ottawa to meet with members of parliament and attend marches for accessible rare disease drugs, all while attending every conference I could find in order to arm myself with the latest research and data around Spinraza, as well as the drug approval and funding process. I looked into legal avenues and I continued to raise my voice. As this was going on, I was in university full-time and volunteering with multiple organizations. I was exhausted, But walking alongside my fight was my support system and the support of people I had never even met before to keep me moving forward. My community raised enough for my first dose of Spinraza, but then began a fight with the healthcare system to administer the drug and a stubborn pharmaceutical company to allow me to purchase a dose directly. I added meetings with the head of Alberta Health Services and neurology while also researching private radiology clinics to my daily routine. I cried in so many of those meetings, crushed by the weight of my fight and the toll that I saw SMA having on my body every day while a treatment existed. There were so many days when I wanted to give up and didn't believe that I would ever convince the doctors and the government that I and everyone with SMA deserved that treatment. There were days where I'd end my day crying to my best friend out of fear, doubt, and vulnerability overload. But she never let me stop believing that I deserved that treatment and that everyone with SMA deserved that treatment. At a conference in Ottawa, I learned of a funded clinical trial for another promising SMA treatment, which was less invasive and more cost effective. The only catch was I required a dose of Spinraza to qualify. With the promise of a long-term solution if I received Spinraza, my first dose was finally booked. The first attempt was unsuccessful and painful. It was traumatic, yet something I felt that I had to share with the thousands of supporters who'd been following my story and were waiting to hear the news. Despite never wanting to think about the long hour and multiple needles pressed against my spine ever again, I felt I had to continue to share the details as though I owed it to each person who had helped to make it possible. I was booked to come back a week later, and finally, the 5 mils of magic entered my body. You'd think this is the end of the story, but the curveballs continued. A week after finally receiving my first dose, I was told that the criteria for the clinical trial had finally been finalized and a minimum of 4 doses were required 6 months prior to beginning the clinical trial. I couldn't stop there. There was still so much uncertainty around whether adults with SMA would ever receive funded access to Spinraza. So the fundraising continued, my family took out loans, and I kept advocating. I would now need $240,000 in order to receive enough Spinraza to meet the criteria, or for the government to fund enough doses for me to receive 5 years of guaranteed treatment. The fight continued, the curveballs continued. The hospital didn't want to administer 3 more doses, and the pharmaceutical company didn't want to sell me anymore. Then, the pharmaceutical company removed their compassionate pricing program, bringing the cost per dose from $60,000 to $120,000 per dose. While fighting to purchase the drug at a somewhat feasible price, the clinical trial contacted me and told me they weren't sure they could save my spot much longer, as there were only 10 spots and they needed to get the trial started. It was the most stressful time in my life, but it was worth it. We got there, and today I sit here with 4 doses of Spinraza and 2 years into a clinical trial, healthier and stronger than I've been in years. I say we because I could never have fought this hard alone. It was the hardest fight of my life, but the most rewarding by far. Today, Spinraza still isn't available for everyone in Canada, but because of our advocacy, over half of the SMA population is receiving treatment right now. But we won't stop until everyone with SMA has access to this life-saving medicine. No person should have to beg their community for money when a life-saving treatment for a terminal diagnosis exists. No family should be taking out maximum loans to save their child's life. Children and adults with SMA were losing their ability to eat, speak, and breathe while a treatment sat on the shelf. Children and adults with SMA were dying. Not all advocacy is as extreme as fighting for your life. Sometimes it's advocating for home care, for medical care, for accessibility within your own family, or for awareness to a cause or issue. Now that I have begun advocating and discovering the power of my voice and the change it can bring about, I can't stop. It is my dream to empower those with disabilities to also step into their power and see their worth. Is it fair that our community has to fight so hard? No. But each fight paves the way for the next person who comes along in our shoes. Each time you advocate, you bring about change, whether on a personal, interpersonal, or societal level. There is no pointless advocating. The world will be unfair and it will be hard, but we can do hard things and continue to work towards equality. Here's what I've taken away from my experience. We need to realize that we are worthy of the support that we require in order to advocate for ourselves without draining ourselves or relying on others for validation of our worth. At times, my advocacy seemed to blur with a popularity contest. Many members of the SMA community believed that by personally fundraising, I was slowing access and the government's process for everyone else. There were those who felt I was interfering with what would be a solution for everyone instead of seeing that my advocacy was for everyone. Others in the community believed that I was pocketing the money and went to the media to say so. There were those who wanted to be in the spotlight for fighting alongside me, and those who believed I was sharing too much. I had to advocate within the people closest to me as to how I wanted to advocate, often having my words edited to match what they believed my advocacy should look like. You have to be confident in your message and willing to push past the hurtful comments and the pushback with advocating. In a world where people with disabilities are constantly reminded that they are seen as less than others, it makes it even more difficult to raise our voice and advocate for ourselves. If we believe we are less deserving of the necessities of life, we are only holding ourselves back. I learned to fully embrace and accept myself. I addressed my internalized ableism and my trauma and began believing in my worth. I began to fight back against the systems refusing to acknowledge my worth and rights. For me, it was vital to continue checking back in with myself and those who knew me best. Ask yourself, is your advocacy making you hate or embrace your cause? Ask yourself if your advocacy is impacting the relationships around you in a positive or a negative way. You can shift your focus at any time, but a focus on desperation will never propel your advocacy as far as a focus on empowerment and belief will. You are worthy, you are capable, and you have the power within you to bring about change. Thank you.